I'm Tom Brake. I'm the director of Unlock Democracy. Now, I suspect many people on the call are members or supporters of Unlock Democracy, but hopefully some are not. So I'll just say a few words about Unlock Democracy. Unlock Democracy, we are a campaigning organisation. We campaign around democratic reform, hence the relevance of Nan's book. And the issues we campaign on, I suppose our unique selling point compared to many other campaigning organisations in the democracy field is that we campaign for a written constitution for the United Kingdom, but we also campaign on proportional representation, for greater transparency and accountability of government, for devolution and human rights more generally. So welcome to this evening, and we're very pleased to have Nan Sloane joining us, who's going to be talking about Uncontrollable Women, her most recent publication. And this is about radicals, reformers and revolutionaries, covering the period from the French Revolution through to the Great Reform Act. So without further ado, thank you, Nan, for joining us. We're looking forward very much to our discussion this evening. And so over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be able to talk about the book and about the women in the book, although this evening I'm going to talk mainly about a piece of legislation rather than individuals. This is a book about, as you say, radical, reforming and revolutionary women in a period that we all think we know quite a lot about, but tend not to when it comes to the detail. So it is bookended, as it were, by the French Revolution, which started in 1789, and the passing of the Reform Act in 1832. And that's a period which, not just in this country, but right across Europe, not to mention various other parts of the world, is absolutely full of incident, revolutions, the success of revolutions, the failure of revolutions, the hopes that revolutions bring, the hope in this country of revolution in some quarters, and the absolute terror of it in others, and widespread movements amongst all classes aimed at securing fundamental change in the constitutional settlement achieved in 1688. And the Reform Act of 1832 is the culmination of that wave of constitutional campaigning. The book is about the women involved in those campaigns because they usually get left out. If you read most of the standard works on the period, it is a very male world. It's a very male-dominated world. And of course it was. The politics that we tend to read about from that period are male-dominated for the simple reason that women were excluded from Parliament, though not actually from participation in politics, as we'll see. And they did not hold the levers of power. But the fact that women didn't hold the levers of power didn't mean that they weren't involved and engaged in the constitutional campaigns that were happening. They were profoundly involved, but they were not even written out, but just left out of the accounts, often because it suited the narrative of the times to do that. So in the case of Peterloo, for instance, which happened in 1819, the radical narrative was that women were at Peterloo as a demonstration of the peacefulness of the assembly, and that the men had brought their women and children with them to show that there was no intent towards violence. And in fact, large numbers of women were there in organised groups as members of their own reform societies with their own banners. They had marched there in formation. They were at the front, which is why so many were women, one of the reasons why women were disproportionately injured at Peterloo. And they had a voice of their own. There were women on the platform who were intending to speak at the event, and yet you would not know that from most accounts of it. So they just slip out of the narrative. The 1832 Reform Act was the, as I say, the culmination of much of this campaigning. But it also marks a fundamental shift in how the political establishment and the middle and upper classes came to view constitutional reform over the course of that period. In 1789, throughout the 1790s and the early part of the century, there were working class reform movements which were viewed by the government as either actually or potentially revolutionary, because the government was in a state of terror and had convinced itself that any change would lead to revolution. And so there was a series of ferociously small c conservative governments, and a working class which was intent on achieving reform. And the parliamentary reform movement ebbed and flowed over a 20-year period. Sometimes it was very strong, then they arrested all the leaders, locked them up, and at other times it weakened. Their basic demands were universal suffrage, by which they meant universal male suffrage, annual parliaments, secret ballots. And then various other demands got added onto that at various points as people came and went in the movement, but that was the core of what they were campaigning for. And there was, as I say, strong resistance to that in all quarters. In the 1820s, there was, however, a shift, and part of the shift was social, but it resulted in political change. The first big legislative change was the abolition of the Test and Corporation Acts, which had existed since 1688 and which prevented non-conformists from having any civil rights, either political, or they could not go to university, they couldn't take part in the professions. And there had been a long campaign to get those abolished, which was part of a middle-class reform campaign. And that was their first serious success, though it had taken several decades to achieve. And that was then followed by the much more contentious Catholic Emancipation Act, which had a huge effect in Ireland in particular. And in the course of that act being passed, several decisions were made which suggested to people that it would be possible to pass a reform act in Britain which might not lead to revolution. And there was an acceptance that if you enfranchised the middle classes and not the working classes, you would end up with a sustainable constitution in which a large, wealthy and growing middle class had a stake, not just in terms of the economy, but also in terms of the politics. And that you would then be able to resist further calls from working class organisations for reform. one of the things that had been decided as part of the Catholic Emancipation Act was to raise the property qualification from a rateable value of £2 to 10. And £10, which sounds like nothing at all to us, was way out of the reach of most working class people. It was just not achievable. And so this became part of the proposals for the Reform Act. There were various others, but the core of it was to set the qualifications so high that the majority of people would be excluded. And the campaigning around the Reform Act was huge. There was a very clever tactic on the part of the government and the middle class organisations which had sprung up to advocate for this particular piece of reform to persuade the working class it was in their interest to pass it. And so you get the massive demonstrations that people talk about in support of a piece of legislation which would not enfranchise them and would enfranchise the mill owners, the employers, their exploiters, and their the people against whom or by whom they were effectively economically and often socially oppressed. And there were campaigns in both directions. In the end, the Act was passed after a lot of difficulty, and within 2 years, when the new Poor Law was passed, working class people realised that they were not going to benefit, and that far from it, they were actually going to be penalised for their lack of political power. But it did stave off any further constitutional reform until the 1860s. So the extension of the next extension of the franchise didn't happen until 1868. Secret ballot didn't come in until 1873. Universal male suffrage didn't happen until 1918. Partial female suffrage in 1918. Equal suffrage in 1928. So a very long haul. There are three things that I would. I'm a minute or two over, but I'll just say these three things that I would say are lessons from that campaign. The first is that once the establishment concedes the need for change, it takes it over. So while it's a campaign, it's in the hands of campaigners. But once the establishment agrees that that change is needed, it acquires control because it writes the legislation. If we had a written constitution, there is the crucial question of who would write it, and how it would be agreed. And the working class organisations who had campaigned so hard for reform before 1832 lost control of their own campaign to the middle classes, and then lost control of the outcomes. So that's the first thing, is that as soon as you win, you lose, because you lose control. So you need to have a mechanism. The same pattern got repeated with the female suffrage campaign much later. So it's a thing that happens on a regular basis. The second thing is that you need to do what the middle classes did then and wait for your opportunity and then seize it. And certainly there was a lot of increasing agitation amongst middle classes, particularly in the Midlands and the North, at their lack of representation. And they knew that once the Catholic Emancipation Act was through, their claim for representation would be irresistible. And so it is to wait for the moment, but then move quickly when it arises. And the third is be very careful of the consequences and the detail. One of the things the Great Reform Act did was remove the right to vote from women, who had had it prior to that. Hadn't very often exercised it, but they had had it. And the Reform Act was specific that only men could vote. That directly led to the need for a female suffrage campaign, which took another 30 years to develop, and which basically was asking for the restoration of pre-1832 rights, in other words, a property-based franchise on an equal basis with men. And so it's hard to know whether they intended to deprive women of the vote or whether it was just a thing that happened and nobody noticed. But the detail really matters and the consequences really matter. So that's a sort of canter through the Reform Act and all the ins and outs of it. It's the last chapter of the book, so it's the culmination of a long period of campaigning. There are mixed views. You can see I'm not entirely a fan of the Great Reform Act because I think it caused more problems than it solved, but I am very happy to answer questions or hear differing opinions and talk about any aspect that you're interested in.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nan. That was absolutely brilliant. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but then we're going to go into the Q&A to take questions from people there, and we'll be asking them to ask their own questions. So get ready for that. What you said about when the establishment concedes, then you've lost control, and that I must say that makes me think of 1997. Of course, the campaign that Charter 88, our predecessor organisation, was running for widespread democratic reforms. In 1997, the establishment took on some of those reforms and basically, I think, pretty much killed the campaign at that point, because devolution was very successfully delivered, but other aspects of that campaign, such as PR, were not delivered. So it took the wind out of the sails for Charter 88 to some extent, and I think we're trying to build back up the same sort of momentum. On the question of be very careful of the consequences, what you were saying about the Great Reform Act makes me think about the AV referendum in some respects, in that might it have been better not to have it, because of course now people will refer to the fact, well, we've done that, even though it wasn't a referendum on PR. Do you feel that the 1832 Reform Act, did it achieve anything, or would it have been much better simply not to have had it and allowed the momentum to build so that something more substantial could have been implemented in terms of reforms?
I think this issue of settling things for a generation is something that happens all the time with contentious subjects. And certainly in 1832, there was a view that that's it, that's done. We don't need to come back to constitutional issues now, for at least a generation. And indeed, they did not. And the Chartist movement grew out of people's frustration, in particular with the new Poor Law, which introduced workhouses and penalised poverty in a way that I think we can all still recognise today. And I incline to the view that by and large, it was very successful in that it did what they set out to do. So if you're measuring success by, they set out to kill off the reform movement, to widen the franchise up to a point, to deal with the nonsenses like some of the rotten, the very small electorates and so on. They did all that. They didn't do it entirely successfully. One of the there were many ways around it for people who owned votes. And I quote in the book the example of Sophia Elizabeth Lawrence from Ripon in Yorkshire, who effectively owned the town, owned all the property that qualified for votes, and therefore was able was recognised as being the person who decided who the MPs were, and she carried on doing that afterwards. She found ways round the law to enable her to continue to control the voting of the town well into the 1850s. So for people who were in that position, it didn't make a lot of difference. But for working class people, it made a huge difference, because they not only lost control of the campaign, they lost the campaign itself. And the mythology around the Reform Act, that it had dealt with the problem, is so great that we still call it the Great Reform Act, as though somehow it resolved the democratic problem of the age. And it did for the middle classes. It enfranchised the men of the middle classes and enabled them to pass a series of legislation which may or may not have benefited the people working for them. Often not, and often only after major campaigns. And a lot of working class campaigning shifted into the early trade union movement, because they recognised that they'd lost the argument on the constitutional front. So would it have been better if it had never happened? It might have been different if it had been delayed for a few years more. But I think it was inevitable that once the middle class had moved in and occupied the space, some kind of legislation of that nature was going to happen. I think the opportunity was missed in the 1810s because of the fear of revolution and the determination not to give in, not to give votes to working people. Once Peterloo had happened and the legislation, the repressive legislation passed after that, it's very difficult to see how the working classes could have succeeded when their moment had gone.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to ask Jane Robbins whether she would like to ask hers. My last question is just about, there are, I think, virtually no references to London in your book, or at least women involved in politics in London. Is that because you have an aversion to London? Is it because there were no women active in politics in London? Or was it because perhaps these movements were generated around the mill towns where a lot of people were in work? I mean, why the focus on everything that isn't London in the book?
Well, I mean, I obviously, given that I live in Leeds, I'm quite happy to point out that London is not necessarily the centre of every universe. But it's also the case, I think, that there were reform movements in London. Obviously, there was the London Corresponding Society during the early parts of the French Revolution. There was a parallel reform movement in London in the 1810s, with which there was a slightly difficult relationship between them and the Northern reform movements. But the locus of the reform movement shifted northwards, and so the participation, or the sort of the chain of events that I will have followed in the book, moved northwards. Certainly began in London, so London and Paris, given that it's the French Revolution, but when the reform movement, the wave of reform agitation that led up to Peterloo began, it was mainly located in the north, the Midlands to some extent. And obviously things were in London, but there were developments in the north for women that didn't exist in London. So the London reform societies did not admit women. Neither did the Northern reform societies, but in the north, women went off and set up their own. And that didn't happen in London. Many of the women that I've written about started their lives in the north, even if they ended up in London later on in life. And the because of the huge development, because of the Industrial Revolution, the massive social changes that there were in the North and the Midlands, there was people were much more open to broader participation and to more inclusive for the times, which is, wouldn't be inclusive by our standards, but inclusive by the standards of the times, ways of doing things. Whereas London was much more structured and formalised, I think, than the looser associations of the North, which meant that women could and did participate.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't think you had an aversion to London, really. But, so Jane Robbins, would you like to ask your question? Your question, Jane, was one that I needed to know the answer to as well. So Jane, would you like to ask it, or shall I ask it for you?
Yeah.
Great. Over to you, Jane.
You mentioned early on annual parliaments, and I wondered what exactly you meant by that.
Well, our parliaments technically last for 5 years, though, that hasn't actually happened since the Fixed Parliaments Act. In the early part of the 19th century, parliaments could and did last for 7 years. So there would be 5, 6, 7 years between elections. During the 1832 Reform Act agitation, there were several general elections. But it was unusual to have more than one over a period of time. They were very expensive. They were a spectator sport for most people because people didn't have votes and therefore participated in ways that we would now find completely unacceptable, because they were more like football crowds at elections than they were participators in democracy. And the reform movement thought that it would be easier to hold people to account if there were elections every year. And so they wanted annual parliaments. So you would be elected for the year, and they would then be able to recall you in theory. In practice, of course, it's always been the demand that slides off the end, because actually people don't really want elections on a regular basis. They want the electoral system, whatever it is, to work. And so, if an election every 5 or 7 years is expensive, an election every year is going to be horrendously expensive. And so it was never the demand of choice, and universal suffrage and secret ballots were always going to be the ones that succeeded rather than annual parliaments, because it's attractive in theory, but it would be nightmarish in practice. And we only have to think about the last few years when we've been going, not another one, at the distance of a couple of years, to see how difficult most people would have found that, and how it actually might be damaging to engagement in democracy.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm now going to ask Marisha Ray to ask her question about, hi Marisha, about taxation and progressive taxation. And just before she does that, obviously that model of annual elections is one that has been adopted in relation to some local authorities. So people get a chance every year to
by
elect
thirds,
some,
though, by thirds,
some of their local councillors. Marisha, would you like to ask your question about taxation?
Thank you. At this time yesterday, I was speaking with someone who's an expert in taxation and progressive taxation. And at the time when we were speaking, I was very enthusiastic about what he was suggesting. However, when I thought about it afterwards, I realized that it would make it impossible for people who are currently in the middle classes to continue to own property and to thus have a lower cost of living that they have now. And so I wanted to ask you, how do we avoid making the same mistakes again, where we make the super rich richer and the poor poorer, and treat them badly for that? How do we avoid that step where we increase inequality before reversing the trend?
That's a a large question, and not one that I have addressed in the book. I think it is a much more complex question now than it was at the beginning of the 19th century, because we have seen the outcomes of all the changes that happened then. And both the economy and society were much more fluid then. There was much less certainty about what constituted class. People understood what constituted the upper classes, but when it came to who is working class and who is middle class, it was much more fluid. You could, you know, be like Robert Owen and start as a working class kid, get apprenticed, buy a company, sell a company, be extremely rich by the time you were in your mid-20s. And that was possible. That was a realistic possibility. And there was much less understanding of the operation of capital and much less understanding of the interconnection of economic factors and social factors. So I think, given that you're asking the question about now, it is much more complicated. I am not a tax expert. I think that capitalist societies will always tend to favour the rich because they are tend to be in control. I think that the narrative that the vote is the thing that changes society was always a mistaken one. And I think the female suffrage campaign is a demonstration of that, in that the mere having of the vote changes very little. It's what you are able to do with it. And if the rest of your democratic structures are structured so as to prevent you doing anything with it, it's going to take you a very long time to be in any kind of position to make a change. So I can't give you a detailed answer, I'm afraid, because I'm not an expert, as I say, on either tax policy or the economy. But I think you can see the seeds of all of those questions in the period that I have been writing and thinking about. And they were difficult to answer then, and even more difficult to answer now, particularly in the current circumstances.
Maybe that's the subject of your next book,
Be surprised.
I'd now like Vicky Seddon to ask her question, and that's about a linkage with the present day in terms of the elections bill, and particularly the, well, I'll let Vicky speak to it. Vicky.
Yes, thank you, Nan. Thank you so much for the clarity of what you've been saying to us, because that whole thing about the contradictions within the Great Reform Act and how people were deluded into thinking it was in their interests is a very pertinent comment, which we need to take real account of in terms of anything to do with the Constitution or democracy questions. And what's going through my mind is, you know, the elections bill, which is currently going through Parliament, which has got all kinds of, in my opinion, shocking attempts to reduce democracy, but is seen by some people as being positive. And in particular, the thing about voter ID, you know, we don't want people who don't have the right to vote to be voting. And so it seems to me there are a lot of lessons to be learnt from what you've been saying in terms of our current campaigning and practice about how to try to make sure that people aren't deluded into thinking that something's in their interest when it clearly isn't.
I think this is a very old tactic, isn't it? That you present something as a problem, which isn't actually a problem. You know, voter fraud is not a serious problem in this country. And then you introduce the thing you actually want to do off the back of persuading people that the problem exists. And that happens, I think, more than we necessarily think it does, because obviously that's the point, is that we don't necessarily see it coming. I think in the case of the Reform Act, that the press had a major role in persuading people that this was going to resolve the problem, and you know, and turn them into one of the dangerous narratives that we have in this country is that we are the mother of all democracies, and that we are the best democracy in the world and the fairest democracy in the world, and that we got it right hundreds of years ago, and we don't change it now. And in fact, of course, we know that none of that is true. We know that the 1688 settlement was discriminatory, was anti-democratic, was exclusively the property of the propertied class, that persisted, that as you know, well into the 20th century, property qualifications still existed for voting in this country, that it's taken a long time to shift from an economic basis for democratic participation to an individual basis for it. And we know that that's been resisted all the way, every inch, by the people who hold the power, whoever those people are at different points in our history. But what we believe is this myth about we are the mother of parliaments, the best democracy in the world, and so on. And so all you have to do is present something as being a threat to that part of your national identity, and people will go, well, yes, of course we we can't have our perfect democracy corrupted by voter fraud. And then people will think it's a good idea. People will say, well, why wouldn't you have some form of identification? Everybody's got some form of identification, which we know not to be the case. And I think it's the same then. And I think it is attacked. I think we are bad at rebutting that. I don't think that we have ever quite got ourselves into a position where we are able to be ahead of that game, where we're able to second guess, where the constant tension between actual democracy and the needs of the people who benefit from our democracy, where those tensions take us. And there are a number of things in the elections bill that I think are covered by this, but I think we need to get better at anticipating what straw person they're going to set up in order that they can knock it down. Because even if the current elections bill goes away, they will be back with something else. This is not something that they get. This is not a one-off. This is a part of a pattern over, as we can see, centuries of progress and resistance to progress. And at the moment, we have a particularly spirited resistance to any form of progress at all.
Thank you, Nan.
To Marisha, yes, best is generally always a fiction.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask DMAC to ask their question. And just to say, I mean, the problem with voter F, and I'm not going to actually mention the word, is that people, the moment you've said it, they believe it is happening, even if you go on and say that it isn't happening. So you have to be careful about even mentioning the word, because people absorb it and take it to be the truth. So, DMAC, are you with us?
Oh, yes. Sorry, my name's Dorothy. I don't know why it comes like that.
Sure.
Yes, I'm interested in how decisions are actually made, because we weren't talking in the 1830s about a progressive parliament. We were talking about a deeply reactionary parliament that was interested in the rights and powers specifically of the landed gentry. And I'm interested in how it was actually won for even the very limited changes of the Reform Act. I lived for a while in New Zealand, and I was interested to discover that rights for the votes for women there, they were the first country to give votes for women. We tell ourselves this narrative that if you have a great cause and you argue for it persuasively, gradually people come over to your side, but that actually didn't happen. It was due to all sorts of political chicanery, people getting fed up with one another, arguments in Parliament between people who couldn't stand one another, nothing to do with the argument itself being won. It's quite extraordinary. You know, so we tell ourselves it's all terribly rational, but in fact, it's very odd how these things occur very often.
Yes, which is why the point about you wait and seize your moment is really important, because obviously in the course of all those other things happening, there are opportunities which if you're ready to seize and use, you can make some headway with. I think the point about how decisions are made is really interesting. In the 1820s, because a number of things which had been the subject of a lot of contention and debate suddenly began to resolve themselves, starting, as I say, with the Test and Corporations Act. And because Catholic emancipation, which was massively controversial because of the idea of Catholics owing allegiance to a foreign power and not being quite British and not holding British values and being a sort of fifth column internal threat, was massively live throughout society. It was very contentious. And so I think one thing that happened was that people thought, well, we've done the Test and Corporations Act, we've done Catholic emancipation. Here's this other contentious question. Let's deal with them all in one go. Secondly, I think what you said about people falling out was true then. This is the period of the end of the Duke of Wellington's career, of huge tensions within political classes. I think there was a recognition that the middle class could go either way, could be either an ally to the establishment or could be a thorn in its side. And they were viewed as being predominantly liberal, and I would say small L liberal, because there wasn't a liberal party as we know it at that point. But they were certainly on the liberal side of most social questions, not so much on economic questions, but certainly on social questions. And they were viewed as potentially being a problem, particularly in the North. And what you do with a problem is co-opt it. Co-opt the source of it if you possibly can. And so they effectively co-opted the middle class, who were very happy to be co-opted, into the governing class. And I think one of the tragedies of the Reform Act is that the working class did not see it coming and did not understand what would come next. And what came next, and came as a terrible shock to people, was poor law reform, which introduced workhouses and the punitive poor law arrangements that we think of as being Victorian, but actually predate that period. And there was huge resistance to that, born partly out of the disappointment of working people and the fury at what was being done to them by people they felt they had supported, who had promised them that they would represent them and look after them. So I think it is very difficult sometimes to resist that happening, partly because it seems so reasonable. You know, if the middle classes have the money and they're running the economy and they're providing work and they're keeping people off the streets and all this kind of thing, why would they not therefore want to be part of the running of the country? And the rotten boroughs situation was clearly nonsensical. Why should not Manchester have representation in Parliament? Why should Leeds not have representation in Parliament? And so it was all very reasonable. And I think that's one of the other things that happens, that, you know, people make the decision that they want sound like the most reasonable decision that people can come to. But I do think that the same decision-making processes operate, whether then or now. The establishment looks for what's in its own best interests and acts on it, even if it looks chaotic at times.
Thank you, Nan. And someone asked a question about the gender balance on this call. Although it's not scientific and is solely based on first names, the answer is 2/3 women, 1/3 men. As I said, that is a completely unscientific assessment of people who are on this call tonight. There's a question from Dorothy Free, which I don't know whether you'd like to ask, Dorothy, around slaves.
No, you ask it.
Okay, let me find the question. So the question was, ancient Greek democracy relied on slaves who had no vote, as did the women who had no vote. Has anything changed with our underclass who do much of the sort of menial manual work, most of whom probably do not vote? So has very much changed since 1832 in terms of political participation and so on?
Since ancient Greece, yes, I think quite a lot has changed. Since 1832, I think quite a lot has changed, if only because whether people choose to vote or not, or feel that they're sufficiently motivated to vote or not, is another question, and a very wide question. But as things stand at the moment, they have votes, and that is a huge change. The electorate in 1832 was extended by about 60%, but 60% of not very much is still not very much. So it was a very small, until 1868, it was a very small electorate, and most people were excluded from it, and that has certainly changed. The make-up in terms of the representational, and I don't think representation is everything, but the representational make-up of Parliament, of the civil service, of other organisations which are part of the establishment and governance of the country, has undoubtedly changed, and is not anywhere near close enough to gender balance, but has a degree, has increased representation, not just from women, but also from other excluded groups. What I think has not changed is that power is still vested in a very small number of people, that the internal workings of that very small number of people are difficult to access and therefore difficult to influence, that most people are excluded from the decision-making process because we have this narrative that if you have a vote, you are therefore included, which isn't actually the case. What you're included in is deciding who you have, who you're going to have as your representative in Parliament. That does not mean that you're included in the decision-making process about issues. So I think our focus on the vote, I think this is one of the problems with the reform movements throughout the 19th century, is that they led us to focus on the vote itself as the answer to the problem. And so, you know, when in 1918, when 60% of women got the vote, there was a lot of stuff written about, now we're sorted, now we're going to see real change in society, now women are going to have power, now women are going to have real political influence, now women are going to be at the heart of decision making, and we'll see legislation coming through that will benefit women and that will change women's position in society. And none of that happened. It took decades to get into three figures for the number of women MPs. Well, it took until 1997 to get into three figures for the number of women MPs, let alone to get, we still have not got parity in terms of women MPs. We don't have parity of women in the cabinet. And we don't have a situation in which the impact of legislation on women is a primary consideration. It sort of gets tacked on at the end if we're lucky, and most of the time we aren't lucky, and so it isn't. And it still took decades to change. You know, in my adult lifetime, women had to get counter signature from their husband or father in order to sign loan agreements or get mortgages. Rape within marriage was not a criminal offence until the 1990s. So it's taken a long time. And we are currently in a situation where rape is virtually a decriminalised offence. And so the fact that somebody has a vote does not mean that what comes out of the centres of power is going to benefit them, and we haven't yet squared off that that conundrum really of how do you get actual power, how do you get a political system that actually balances the interests of different groups in society and actually comes out with changes to society that would be revolutionary if they happened. And therein lies the problem, because now, as then, governments are more afraid of change than they are of justice.
Thank you, Nan, and for reinforcing the point that democracy isn't about just voting once every 4 or 5 years. There has to be things in between, for instance, which is why we advocate citizens' assemblies as a way of the public participating in some critical decisions. I think you've partially answered, there was one of the first question, or the first question was from Marisha Ray about what proportion of women are still being held back by the types of stereotypes which were in place at that time, or the time of Peterloo. And I think you've confirmed that there is still, unfortunately, a significant proportion of women who are, in fact, held back by those.
I don't think they're being, if I can just interrupt you, John, I don't think they're being held back by the stereotypes from Peterloo, because I think with this, as with other things, we have a mythology, but I think it's a different kind of mythology with this. It's impossible for us to understand what the lives of women were like, because we have rights and legal standing that they did not have. And so in 1819, you were held back by the fact that you had no legal existence. because so if you were married, because most women were married, so you ceased to exist for legal purposes on the day that you married. You lost any right to property, you could not legally act on your own, you could not sign documents, you could not make a will, you could not sue, you could not be sued. Your wages were paid to your husband, your work was considered your husband's property, your body was your husband's property. One of the questions I often hear discussed is why Jane Austen never married. Just seeing Jane Austen in the chat, and the answer is because she would. One of the answers, I'm sure, is that she would have lost the copyright to all her books. She would have lost the income from all her books, as Charlotte Bronte did when she married. And so the things that held those women back are different from the things that hold us back. The stereotypes that held them back are different from the stereotypes that hold us back. And I think we should always be careful of fighting old battles and not addressing ourselves to the new ones. So, you know, I think that there are challenges facing women now that did not face women then, just as there were challenges that faced women then that do not face them now. And I am very keen on taking the mythology out of both our politics and our feminism and dealing with the actual issues that are in front of us, and not the ones that no longer apply to most of us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Nan. I think that is the perfect place on which to stop. And unfortunately, we've reached, or we're about to reach in a few seconds, 8 o'clock. I think that has been a fantastic, really informative webinar, and certainly the comments from people in the chat are confirming that. We have circulated the link to the book in the chat. And if people want it sent to them in other ways, then you've got our email address because you've been in touch with us previously. We will happily send out that link in an email if you'd like it in that form. So thank you, Nan. It's been a pleasure having you with us, and hopefully we will have you again when the next book is published. So
thank you very much. I've enjoyed it, and thank you for inviting me.
And thank you, Grace, for making sure that we ran smoothly this evening. So look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.